It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when everything changed. My wife, Sarah, who has been disabled for several years, was out in our yard with our two young kids, enjoying the fresh air. We had recently moved to a small, quiet neighborhood, hoping for a peaceful life away from the hustle and bustle of the city. But as fate would have it, peace was short-lived. Our neighbor, Karen, an outspoken member of the HOA, had never liked us from the beginning. She was one of those people who thought they could control everything from the color of our house to the way we parked our cars. We had tried to stay friendly, but she made it clear from the start that she didn't want us here. That day, Sarah was sitting on a bench in the yard when Karen appeared on our driveway, storming toward her. I was inside preparing lunch for the kids when I heard the commotion. I rushed outside, only to be met with the horrifying sight of Karen standing over Sarah, who was now bleeding from her side. Karen had attacked her. Before I could even process what had happened, Karen stood there almost smugly and said she looked suspicious. She had to be stopped. It was an absurd, cold statement that made no sense. Sarah, who had been minding her business, was the victim of a vicious attack for no reason at all. Our children were screaming in terror, witnessing the entire ordeal. It was the most terrifying moment of my life, one that I would never forget. The rage and disbelief flooded me as I rushed to Sarah's side. But it wasn't just the attack that shocked me. It was the fact that Karen thought she had the right to do it, as if her sense of control justified her actions. The next few hours were a blur. I rushed Sarah to the hospital, my hands shaking as I tried to keep her calm. The kids were in a state of shock, and I didn't know how to explain to them that the woman they had seen every day, the one who had seemed so harmless, had just attacked their mother. At the hospital, the doctors worked quickly to stabilize Sarah. She had been stabbed just below her ribs, and the blood loss was significant. The kids, thankfully, were not physically harmed, but the trauma they had witnessed would last far longer than any physical injury. The police arrived at the hospital to take statements, and I could barely get the words out. Karen had attacked my wife in front of our children, and her reasoning made no sense. The officers seemed baffled by her actions, but they took their time. They didn't rush to arrest her, and I could sense that they were still trying to piece together what had really happened. When I finally got the chance to speak to the detectives, I was furious. I wanted justice, and I wasn't going to let Karen's warped sense of authority go unpunished. But as they questioned me, I couldn't help but feel a pang of fear. Was this really just a case of a neighbor snapping, or was there something more sinister at play? The next day, Karen was arrested, but her behavior was shocking. When she was taken into custody, she was eerily calm, as if she was perfectly justified in what she had done. It didn't take long for her to offer her explanation. According to Karen, Sarah had looked suspicious. She claimed that Sarah had been lurking around her house, watching her through the windows, and that her actions had made Karen feel unsafe. But none of it made sense. Sarah had been in our yard, minding her own business, and Karen had come to our house unprovoked. The more I listened to Karen's version of events, the more I realized that this wasn't about Sarah's behavior at all. It was about Karen's need to control and dominate, to decide who belonged and who didn't. Karen had a long history of making life difficult for anyone she didn't like, and I began to suspect that this was just the latest chapter in her campaign of harassment. The more the police dug into her past, the more they uncovered about her aggressive tendencies and her apparent need for control. It wasn't just about Sarah, it was about Karen's inability to tolerate anyone who didn't conform to her ideals. The entire situation left me feeling disgusted and powerless. How had we ended up in this position? How had we gone from neighbors to victims of such a violent act? As the days passed, I began to realize that the legal battle ahead would be long and difficult. Karen was not going to let this go easily. She had already begun to spin her story, claiming that she was acting in self-defense and that Sarah's body language had somehow made her feel threatened. But this was not a case of self-defense. It was a case of unchecked aggression, of a woman who had decided that she had the right to control everything around her. As the case moved forward, I felt a deep sense of urgency. I wasn't just fighting for Sarah's recovery, I was fighting for our family's safety and for the justice we deserved. We hired a lawyer who specialized in criminal cases, and they immediately began working on gathering evidence. Witness statements, photographs from the scene, and medical reports were all carefully examined. We were determined to make sure that Karen was held accountable for what she had done. I spent hours going over the details, trying to understand how we had gotten here. It felt like a nightmare, but I knew one thing for sure. I was not going to let Karen get away with this. As the investigation continued, the police uncovered more about Karen's history. It turned out that this wasn't the first time she had caused trouble. She had a long history of confrontations with other neighbors, and there were multiple complaints against her for harassment, bullying, and aggressive behavior. What had started as a minor issue over property lines or petty disagreements had escalated into a full-blown attack. Karen's behavior was no longer a surprise, it was part of a pattern. She had tried to control her neighbors, intimidate them, and enforce her own set of rules. The more I learned about Karen, the more I realized that this attack on Sarah was the culmination of years of built-up resentment. Karen had never been content with simply living in a neighborhood, she had to rule it. And when Sarah, an outsider to her worldview, didn't conform, Karen decided to act. The knowledge of Karen's past made me more determined than ever to bring her to justice. She had attacked my wife and traumatized my children, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it just because of her position in the HOA. Months passed before the case finally made it to trial. The courtroom was tense as Karen sat on the defendant's side, her expression cold and detached. She seemed unfazed by the gravity of the charges against her, as if she truly believed that she was justified in attacking Sarah. The prosecution presented a strong case, focusing on Karen's history of aggression and her irrational response to a harmless situation. They argued that Karen had acted with malice, that her actions were premeditated and calculated. But Karen's defense was as bizarre as it was flimsy. She insisted that Sarah's body language had made her feel unsafe, and she clung to the idea that she had acted in self-defense. It was clear that Karen's defense was a last-ditch attempt to avoid responsibility. But as the trial went on, it became apparent that the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence against her was overwhelming. She had attacked Sarah without provocation, and there was no valid reason for her actions. I watched as the trial unfolded, knowing that this was our moment to ensure that Karen faced the consequences of what she had done. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. Karen was found guilty of aggravated assault. The judge sentenced her to several years in prison, and the sense of relief that washed over me was indescribable. This wasn't just a victory for Sarah, it was a victory for our family, for all the victims who had been affected by Karen's tyranny. The sentencing sent a message that no one, no matter their position or authority, was above the law. For Sarah, the road to recovery was just beginning. The physical wounds would heal, but the emotional scars would take much longer. But knowing that Karen would be held accountable gave us a sense of closure that we had desperately needed. The aftermath of the trial was bittersweet. While we had won justice, the trauma lingered. Sarah struggled with the emotional toll of the attack, and the kids were still grappling with the fear and confusion of witnessing such violence. But we were determined to move forward. We sought therapy for the whole family, and slowly but surely we began to rebuild our lives. The neighborhood, once filled with tension and fear, was beginning to heal as well. Many of our neighbors reached out to offer support, and some even apologized for not speaking out sooner about Karen's behavior. In the end, we learned a powerful lesson. Justice may take time, but it is worth fighting for. Karen's actions had caused immeasurable harm, but they had also brought us closer as a family. We were stronger than we had ever been, and no one could take that away from us.